I never imagined the person trying to end my life would be my own son. Those words still burn inside me, as raw today as they were the moment his hands pressed against my back. I was 60 years old, standing on a narrow cliff with the valley yawning beneath me, the kind of drop that erases you in seconds. The air was sharp, cold enough to sting my lungs, but it wasn't the wind that made me tremble. It was betrayal. George, my husband, stood beside me. His grip tightened around my hand, and I could feel his body tense, bracing against the loose stones that shifted under our shoes. We were supposed to be celebrating 40 years together, a simple hike, a family outing, nothing more. Yet behind us stood Ryan, our younger son, and Emily, his wife, smiling as if this moment was nothing but a picture-perfect memory in the making. Only I knew it was a trap. The push wasn't gentle. It wasn't a stumble or an accident. It was deliberate, forceful, final. My stomach dropped as the ground vanished, and for a heartbeat I was weightless. The world spinning sky and stone into a blur. Pain exploded when I struck the rocks. The breath knocked clean from my chest. Through the haze, I heard George's whisper, a plea, a command, a lifeline: stay still. Don't move, play dead. I forced my body to obey, even as panic screamed inside me. Above us, their voices rose, weaving lies about an accident, rehearsing grief they did not feel. That was the moment everything shattered. My son, the boy I once cradled and comforted, had tried to kill me. But before that day, before the cliff and the fall, our family life looked so different, or at least I believed it did. When I think back to the years before everything unraveled, what I see first is the quiet comfort of our home. It wasn't grand, just a modest house on a tree-lined street, but every corner held the warmth of a life George and I had built together. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and coffee in the mornings. The living room echoed with laughter during holidays, and the backyard carried the sound of our boys running and shouting until the fireflies came out at night. David was the heart of that noise and joy. From the time he was little, he had this boundless energy, a light that seemed to pour out of him. He was curious about everything, always eager to help George in the garage, sanding wood or asking questions about how things worked. He used to tell me he wanted to build bridges one day, bridges that would stand for generations. His dreams filled me with pride, and I could picture the man he would become so clearly. Ryan, our younger son, was different. He was quieter, reserved, often retreating into himself. While David filled a room with laughter, Ryan sat back, watching, thoughtful but distant. I told myself children grow in their own time, that his silence was just his nature. I tried not to compare them, though the contrast was hard to ignore. I loved him just as fiercely, even in his silence. Our family routines gave me comfort. Sunday dinners after church, when George carved the roast and David shared stories of his classes, were moments I treasured. Ryan sat at the table too, his eyes lowered, his fork moving slowly. I sometimes wished he would join in, but I reminded myself not everyone expresses joy the same way. Looking back now, I see faint shadows woven into those golden years, small cracks I brushed aside because it was easier to believe everything was fine. At the time, I thought we had the perfect balance of love, stability, and hope for the future. But that happiness was far more fragile than I realized, and it wouldn't be long before tragedy shattered it beyond repair. It began on an ordinary evening, the kind you never expect to end in tragedy. David was supposed to be home for dinner. The roast sat cooling on the table, the mashed potatoes untouched, the clock ticking louder with each passing minute. At first, I told myself he must have stayed late with friends, or gotten caught up in his studies. But as the hours stretched on, unease turned into panic. George and some neighbors went out with flashlights, combing the trails and the back roads, calling his name into the night. I stayed at the window, clutching my sweater tight, praying to see his tall frame walking up the path. When dawn broke, the search ended with words that hollowed me out. They found him at the bottom of a rocky gorge just outside town. The police said he must have stumbled in the dark, that it was an accident no one could have prevented. I heard their voices, but they felt distant, like echoes underwater. My son, my beautiful boy with dreams of building bridges, was gone in an instant. The day of the funeral remains burned into my memory. I wore the same black dress I had worn to my mother's funeral, but the weight of this loss was heavier than anything I had ever carried. I sobbed until my body gave out, and George held me up when my legs refused to work. The church was filled with faces blurred by tears, but all I could see was the casket, too small to contain all the life David had inside him. Ryan sat quietly through it all. He didn't cry. His face was unreadable, a mask of silence that chilled me even in my grief. I told myself it was just his way of coping, that not everyone shows pain the same. Yet a small part of me felt unsettled by his stillness. How could a brother not shed a single tear? George whispered words of comfort to me, but even then there was something in his eyes, something he wasn't saying. At the time, I was too broken to press him, too desperate to believe the story of a tragic accident. But deep inside, I felt a flicker of doubt, a shadow I refused to face. Looking back now, I know that day was more than just the loss of a son. It was the beginning of a truth far darker, a truth that would take years to surface. And in the days that followed, I began to notice Ryan change in ways I could not yet understand. In the weeks after David's funeral, I watched Ryan step into a role I never thought he would take. He began rising early, helping George in the workshop, carrying heavy loads without being asked. He would check on me during the evenings, sitting with me in the living room while I stared at the empty chair that used to be David's. His presence felt steady, almost comforting. And for a while, I told myself that maybe this was God's way of giving me strength through my younger son. I clung to the hope that David's death had awakened something inside Ryan. He seemed more attentive, asking about my health, offering to do the errands, even cracking small jokes to make me smile. There were moments when I felt the warmth of family return, moments when I believed the wound could slowly heal. When Ryan met Emily, it felt like another blessing. She was polite, well-spoken, and eager to help with family gatherings. She carried herself with grace, and I allowed myself to imagine her as the daughter I never had. Their wedding was simple but beautiful, and soon after, the sound of children filled our home again. Holding my grandchildren in my arms, I felt life circling back, offering joy where pain had once consumed me. And yet, there were moments that unsettled me. Ryan's kindness sometimes felt rehearsed, as if he had studied how to act like the perfect son rather than simply being one. When he smiled, there were times it didn't quite reach his eyes. Emily, too, seemed flawless to the point of perfection, her gestures so carefully measured, it was hard to know where sincerity ended and performance began. I brushed those thoughts aside, convincing myself I was being ungrateful. After all, hadn't Ryan grown into the man I had always hoped he would be? Wasn't I supposed to be thankful that life had given me another chance at family happiness? But deep inside, unease lingered. Something about Ryan's transformation was too sudden, too complete, like a mask he wore with practiced ease. And as years passed, that mask began to crack most noticeably when talk of money and inheritance entered our lives. That was when the warmth I thought I had found began to twist into something I could no longer ignore. I spread the papers across the kitchen table, each one a wound that cut deeper the longer I stared. The photographs, the bank records, the marriage certificate with Rebecca's name printed in cold, undeniable ink together. They told a story my son had been too blinded by love to see. Richard had handed them to me with steady hands, but now they trembled in mine. It felt almost sacrilegious to hold proof that could destroy Daniel's world, as though I was betraying him by even looking. I thought back to when he was little, when the only papers I sorted for him were school drawings, pages filled with stick figures and suns too big for the sky. He used to run into the kitchen waving them proudly, asking me to hang them on the refrigerator. Those were the days when love was simple, when my role as his mother was to protect him from scraped knees and childhood fears. Now, the harm was different, hidden in smiles and vows spoken at an altar, and I was no longer sure I could protect him without breaking his heart. My chest ached with guilt. Part of me wanted to shove it all into a drawer, to let the truth rot in silence, to let Daniel keep the illusion he had built with Rebecca. But then I thought of the years ahead, the lies multiplying, the trust eroding, the eventual collapse. Wouldn't that be a deeper cruelty to watch him sink slowly, knowing I had the lifeline in my hands but refused to throw it? I stacked the papers carefully, as if tidying them could soften their weight. I slid them into the envelope, my fingers lingering on each piece, reluctant to let them go. And then I pressed the flap closed. The sound of the seal tearing against the glue was small, almost insignificant, yet it echoed in my ears like a final verdict. With that motion, I knew there was no turning back. I held the envelope against my chest for a moment, whispering an apology he would never hear. I was terrified, guilty, but also strangely steady. For the first time in years, I felt the strength of doing what was right, even if it meant being the villain in my son's eyes. I placed the envelope in my purse, hiding it away, but knowing its presence would follow me everywhere until the truth came out. The time wasn't now, but soon. I could feel it building, like a storm rolling closer with every breath. And I knew the confrontation would come at the dinner table, where secrets had no place left to hide. The house felt unusually still as I set the table that evening, each plate and fork placed with a care that was more about calming my nerves than preparing for dinner. My hands trembled slightly, though I tried to steady them. In my purse, resting just a few feet away on the sideboard, was the envelope. That thin packet of paper seemed to weigh as much as the whole house. Every glance toward it reminded me of what was about to happen, of the fracture I was preparing to unleash within my family. When Daniel and Rebecca arrived, they carried with them the air of forced cheer. Their laughter was a little too light, their smiles too practiced. George poured the wine, his expression neutral, though I caught the flicker in his eyes when they brushed across Rebecca. I wondered if he, too, felt the tightness in the air, the unnatural strain beneath every word exchanged. We sat down together, and the sounds of dinner began the clinking of glasses, the scrape of forks against plates. Yet each sound rang sharp, too loud against the silence that lingered in between. I tried to focus on the food before me, but my stomach turned with every bite. I could barely taste the roast chicken I had prepared, its familiar comfort smothered by the storm building in my chest. Inside my head, the doubts circled endlessly. Was I about to destroy my son's life? Was I betraying him by exposing the truth? Or was I saving him from something far worse? Rebecca smiled sweetly at me across the table, her eyes steady and unyielding. For a moment, I almost faltered. I almost convinced myself that silence would be easier, that perhaps love could survive without truth. But then my hand brushed against the edge of my purse under the table, and I remembered what lay inside. The photographs, the bank statements, the marriage certificate, pieces of proof that spoke louder than denial. I thought of Daniel as a boy, his small hand clutching mine on the way to school, his laughter filling our kitchen during summer evenings. I could not let that boy grow into a man living in shadows, deceived by the very person he trusted most. The meal dragged on, every small talk remark scraping at my nerves like nails against glass. My heart thudded so loudly in my chest that I wondered if anyone else could hear it. At last, the moment came. My hand moved almost on its own, steady despite the storm raging inside me. I reached into my purse, feeling the smooth edge of the envelope, and drew it out. Time seemed to slow. My breath caught as I placed it on the table, sliding it into the center where everyone's eyes would eventually land. My voice was calm, steadier than I felt, but the weight of it nearly broke me. I told myself this was not just paper, it was the truth, sealed and undeniable. The room went silent. The clatter of cutlery ceased. No one moved. The envelope lay there between us, small yet powerful, a barrier that would change everything once opened. And in that suspended moment, as silence pressed down on us like a heavy curtain, I knew there was no going back. The truth was out, and the storm was about to break. The silence after I placed the envelope on the table was louder than any shouting could have been. For a moment, it felt as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My hands trembled in my lap, though I forced my face to stay still, steady, even as my heart raced like a drumbeat in my ears. I could feel every pair of eyes locked on me, their gazes heavy and searching. The clinking of forks against plates had stopped, and the hum of conversation had died in an instant. All that remained was the weight of what I had done. Daniel's eyes were the first I dared to meet. There was disbelief there, almost a pleading look, as though he wanted me to take it all back, to say it was nothing. My chest ached watching his expression crumble from curiosity into something that felt like betrayal. I had always been his safe place, his anchor. Now, in this moment, I had become the storm threatening to tear him apart. Rebecca sat across from me, her face a mask of composure that was beginning to crack. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her shoulders rigid, her eyes darting ever so slightly toward the envelope as though it were a bomb waiting to detonate. She had always been skilled at keeping up appearances, wrapping herself in charm and perfection. But now, with her lies about to be stripped bare, I could see the flicker of fear. It was faint, but it was there a shadow crossing her carefully painted expression. I wanted to reach out to Daniel, to tell him this wasn't meant to break him, but to save him. Yet, even in my silence, I felt the walls going up around him. He was caught between us, his mother and his wife, and the pain of that choice hung in the air like a dagger suspended over his heart. The envelope itself seemed to radiate heat on the polished wood of the table. Inside were the photographs, the bank records, the marriage certificate, cold pieces of paper that carried truths sharp enough to cut. For days, I had rehearsed this moment in my mind, wondering how it would feel. I thought I would feel relief, maybe even triumph, in exposing Rebecca for who she really was. But instead, all I felt was sorrow. Sorrow for my son, for the innocence he was about to lose, and for the life he thought he had built that was about to collapse. The room grew heavier as seconds passed. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each beat a reminder that there was no turning back. I had set this course, and now we were all bound to it. Rebecca's gaze sharpened, and I could almost see her calculating her next move, scrambling to maintain control. Her silence screamed louder than words, and it told me she was already preparing her defense. Daniel's hand moved slightly, fingers brushing against the edge of the envelope. My breath caught. It was as if time froze in that moment. His touch was hesitant, reluctant, like a man afraid of what he might find if he dared to open it. His eyes shifted back to mine, filled with confusion and hurt so raw it pierced me deeper than any blade could. I wanted to whisper that I was doing this out of love, that sometimes protecting someone means wounding them first. But no words would have eased the fracture already spreading through the room. The truth was sitting between us, undeniable, and soon it would speak for itself. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. My pulse hammered in my temples. Every fiber of me wanted to look away, to escape, but I forced myself to stay rooted. This was the moment everything would change, and I had chosen it. Then Daniel's fingers pressed down more firmly on the envelope. He pulled it closer to himself, eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening. The air shifted, heavy with the weight of the revelation waiting to break free. And in that suspended second, before a single word was spoken, before his world shattered or survived, I realized I was watching the exact moment my son's life and mine would never be the same again. The silence held us captive. And then it began to break. The house felt unbearably quiet after that dinner, as though even the walls were holding their breath. The echoes of what had just unfolded lingered in every corner, pressing on me long after the plates were cleared and the chairs pushed back. Daniel would not look me in the eye. That silence between us hurt far more than any words could. It was the silence of a son who could not yet decide if his mother had saved him or betrayed him. I carried that weight with me into the night, lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed his face when the envelope touched his hands, the disbelief, the hurt, the flicker of anger. I wanted to tell him I did it out of love, that tearing his world apart was the only way I knew to protect him. But love is complicated. Sometimes it asks us to be the villain in someone else's story. In the days that followed, the family felt fractured in a way that could not be easily mended. Rebecca avoided me, her mask now thinner, her charm worn down. Daniel kept his distance, speaking little, his heart caught in a war between loyalty and truth. That distance carved into me like a blade. For so many years, I had lived for the sound of his laughter, the comfort of knowing he trusted me completely. Now, all I had was doubt about whether he would ever forgive me, or whether he should. Yet beneath the grief and guilt, I felt something else stirring, a hard, quiet clarity. I knew that lies rot a family from the inside out, that pretending not to see only postpones the collapse. I had chosen to face the storm, even if it meant being drenched and beaten by its force. And though I was hurting, I also knew deep down that I had done what was right. The truth is not gentle. It cuts, it bruises, it leaves scars, but it also cleanses. And sometimes the only way to save someone is to let them break first. Watching Daniel wrestle with the truth broke me. Yet I believed one day he would see the love inside my actions. Perhaps not now, perhaps not for years, but someday. I have learned that family is not just about keeping peace, it is about courage. The courage to face what is hidden, to speak what others are too afraid to say, to risk being hated in order to protect the people you love most. That is the cruelest and purest kind of love. As I sit here now, reflecting on it all, I do not feel triumph. I feel sorrow. Yes, but also strength. I know I may never be the same in my son's eyes, but I also know I refused to let lies destroy him, and that, for me, will have to be enough. If you've ever faced a moment where telling the truth could cost you everything, I hope my story reminds you that silence can cost even more. Sometimes the bravest act of love is the one that makes you look like the enemy. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, please share it. Leave a comment and subscribe for more stories like this, because the truths we carry are never meant to be borne alone.